حبكي عصبية جدومي دنيا عالمي دلالي دلي مدراكي بدارها بمدارها بكوتنا بخبرها بشتغاليا دلالي دلي بسيلك خيني زين غازا بكبرتا علينا.
In February of 1969, Terry Law and his friend Larry Dalton followed God's call to develop a music group to travel and minister at nearby churches while they finished their degrees at Oral Roberts University. But God had bigger plans for Terry and Living Sound. Soon their message of hope and the gospel would begin its inaugural trip around the world. By the end of 1969, Living Sound had landed in Africa for its first tour of Christian concerts and evangelism. In the first year of ministry, the group saw over 7,000 salvations around South Africa, with new believers enrolled in follow-up Bible courses. Before leaving Africa, God spoke to Terry saying, "I'm going to send you behind the Iron Curtain, and you will do things most people will consider impossible."
I shall never forget the moment 6 years ago in southern Africa when the Lord impressed upon me very strongly the fact that He was going to send us to share the gospel in Iron Curtain countries.
From there, God began opening great doors of opportunity for Terry and Living Sound to take the gospel into different nations at critical moments in their histories. In 1972, Living Sound was invited behind the Iron Curtain to perform for the youth of Poland. Ironically, the invitation was provided by the Youth Communist Party, who believed Living Sound was an American rock group.
It was a season that we'll never forget. When Living Sound came to Poland, it was like a perfect storm. The charismatic renewal that was happening in the United States was also happening in Poland. It was known as the Oasis movement. So we're there. Youth are looking for truth. The communists are saying there is no God. It's the opiate of the people. It was like we were the right Christian band in the right country at the right moment.
What began as a misunderstanding led to Cardinal Primate Stefan Wyszynski opening up all the Roman Catholic Church in Poland for Living Sound to perform and minister. The ministry's influence grew, and in 1980, Terry Law, Don Moen, and the entire group were invited to sing in St. Peter's Square in Vatican City, where they also met personally with Pope John Paul II. The Pope showed them great favor and endorsed them for evangelistic ministry after seeing and experiencing their sincere faith. Living Sound continued to minister in a variety of different churches, crossing denominational barriers throughout Europe and into the USSR. As the global ministry expanded, so did Terry Law's teaching ministry. He traveled across the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, leading people to experience God's healing power while teaching profound truths to believers around the world. In subsequent years, he wrote and published books including The Power of Praise and Worship, How to Enter the Presence of God, Healing Promises, The Truth About Angels, and The Fight of Every Believer. Soon, Terry Law became a household name. Meanwhile, his evangelism ministry overseas continued to grow. On a cold January day in 1991, in a small town on the banks of the Lutza River in the former USSR, Terry watched a nearby food line from his post at a Bible distribution. At one point, the bread truck abruptly pulled away from the line, leaving 100 people empty-handed and hungry. An elderly lady approached him and said, "We cannot eat your Bibles."
And I remember that shook me to the core of my being, and I stood there in this cold, and a whole lot of emotions were going on in my head.
It was in this moment, world compassion was birthed in Terry Law's heart.
We need to first minister to their greatest need and then bring the gospel in the other hand. So we'll bring food or clothing or heaters or whatever we can in one hand and the gospel in the other.
Just after the fall of the Soviet Union, World Compassion began printing and distributing over 10 million New Testament Bibles across Russia and Ukraine. In addition, the Story of Jesus booklet took off across the nation after a brief ad on the children's program Superbook, causing over 1 million people to write in requesting their personal copy.
And literally within a couple of weeks, 1 million letters arrived at the post office. The Moscow authorities didn't know what to do with it, and they said, hey, come and get this mail. It's pretty much all yours, and whatever is not yours, just give back to us.
In total, over 10 million Story of Jesus booklets were distributed across Russia over the next few years. World Compassion's mission continued to take shape in communist China through the mid-1990s. Early on, the ministry provided humanitarian aid to victims of massive flooding on the Yangtze River, and were soon introduced to top leadership of the unregistered churches in China. World Compassion and partner CBN secretly dispersed 1 million Bibles while traveling and encouraging churches meeting underground, sometimes narrowly escaping arrest.
Joseph comes running back in. He says, Terry, we got to get out of here now. The police are just coming in the lobby downstairs. I mean, we vacated the premises. We didn't even have time to say goodbye to the brothers. We ran out the door of the room we were in, down the hall to the elevator, jumped on the elevator. And we had no idea what was going to be waiting for us when the door opened.
There's probably 20 troops, with the rifles walking right at the elevator. And Terry looks at them and says to me, let's just walk right through them. Just keep walking. Don't stop for anything.
We walked fast, right through all those soldiers. We were nervous, all the way down from Guangzhou to Hong Kong, wondering if the police were going to chase us, if we were going to end up in jail.
After learning from house church leaders of the desperate need for discipleship and leadership training in their native language, God impressed Terry to develop the Audio Bible Curriculum, or ABC, in Mandarin Chinese. ABC evolved into over 300 hours of systematic and comprehensive Bible teaching. Today, thousands of students continue to study ABC in every province of China. Later, World Compassion developed the China Mission School, another comprehensive program that prepares students throughout the Chinese church to be mobilized in missions. During this time, an opportunity opened to send the gospel into North Korea. World Compassion once again answered the call, producing one of the first evangelistic pieces, The Story of Jesus, in the North Korean dialect. Over 100,000 copies were smuggled into the country in rice sacks, distributed with great enthusiasm by the North Korean people. The Story of Jesus was also printed on balloons and floated across the border. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, World Compassion set its sight on Muslim nations, continuing to follow God's direction to not run from darkness, but to show up and light a candle. Terry and Joel arrived in Kabul, Afghanistan in early 2002 on an oil tanker from Karachi, ferrying jet fuel for the British Air Force. As the war raged in the region, the ministry continued supporting missionaries, medical clinics, and schools teaching literacy, computer skills, and English. In Afghanistan, most women had not had the opportunity to go to school for over 30 years. In the Bamiyan province, our school program was certified by the Ministry of Education, with over 8,000 people being taught in a span of 6 years, the majority being women and children. In the spring of 2003, Jason Law accompanied his father on a trip to Iraq, along with his brother Scott, Joel Vasanen, and General George Asada. They carried over $500,000 of medicine along with other forms of relief across the desert in a caravan of SUVs for a 12-hour drive from Amman, Jordan, arriving in the war-torn city of Baghdad on May 8, 2003. While standing on a hotel balcony overlooking Baghdad's Freedom Square, Jason had a strong impression that God was calling him to full-time ministry with World Compassion.
I remember hearing some gunshots outside, and I go to the window and I look out, and some vehicle tried to come through the checkpoint. The U.S. military, got the situation under control. And outside of the barricades of the hotel, I'm watching people walk down the streets, and people at the market, buying little fruit and vegetables, and ordinary life going on, and just the paradox of just the conflict of what was going on there was just really eye-opening to me. And I remember all of a sudden feeling a very strong impression in my heart, looking out over that square, that God wanted to use me in His kingdom in full-time ministry.
As the crisis in the Middle East continued, World Compassion was there to provide school and medical supplies and monthly food deliveries, along with hundreds of thousands of Story of Jesus booklets and the first ever Kurdish Youth Bible. At the same time, the ministry launched Shoes That Save, a campaign distributing over 95,000 pairs of shoes across northern Iraq, providing an opportunity to share the message of Jesus with thousands of children and their families. In Kurdistan, northern Iraq, World Compassion joined forces with the Kurdish Minister of Interior, Karim Sinjari. Today, they are working alongside leaders to revise their constitution that could one day declare northern Iraq as a safe haven for Christians and other religious minorities in the region. What began as a simple partnership with a local pastor in northern Iraq is now making a way for religious freedom for the growing church in the Kurdistan region. The opportunity for World Compassion to share the gospel in the Middle East grew exponentially as millions of people fled the Syrian civil war, flooding into neighboring countries like Iraq. In 2014, another wave of displaced people fled to the Kurdish region as ISIS advanced and captured the key city of Mosul. Consistent with God's leading in the ministry, Jason and a team already had plans to be in Iraq and arrived 1 week after ISIS took command of the city, providing a rapid response of aid to thousands of refugees. In the months that followed, World Compassion dispersed 260,000 meals, providing food for over 51,000 families, shipped containers of clothes, as well as provided sleeping mats, blankets, and heaters. The team also helped facilitate medical clinics to thousands of refugees, all opening the door to present the message of Jesus to people devastated by both the Syrian civil war and the ISIS invasion. Using northern Iraq as a base, Terry and Jason also negotiated with drug smugglers to carry Bibles into Iran. Over the past few years, World Compassion has moved over 100,000 Bibles into that Muslim nation and empowered the local church to reach their nation more effectively. Meanwhile, the ministry in Asia continued to expand into the country of Myanmar. In 2008, Cyclone Nargis devastated the southern region of the country and killed over 130,000 people. At that time, the military-controlled government immediately cut off issuing visas to aid organizations, including those from the United States, preventing them from coming in to help. Remarkably, Jason and a World Compassion team had already planned and secured visas to travel to the country just days before the disaster struck, opening a door, as only God could, to position World Compassion in partnership with local churches to respond immediately by providing water purification units, food, and assistance to families rebuilding their homes. The relationships that began in that moment of crisis has helped World Compassion retain a lasting impact in the nation of Myanmar. Having now translated our ABC curriculum into the Burmese language, we are empowering local churches to disciple thousands of believers and train emerging leaders. We continue to help plant churches throughout the country and host an annual leadership conference for leaders across denominational lines that has become a must-attend event in the nation. World Compassion also built and helps facilitate one of the finest orphanages in Myanmar. Many of the children who live here lost their parents in the 2008 cyclone and were rescued from the risk of human trafficking. When the relationship between Cuba and the United States was reestablished in 2016, World Compassion relaunched ministry into the country, with several Living Sound concerts helping churches to engage the young adult generation. Today, we are currently assisting with church planting efforts in the island nation.
I think one of the most important things that we do in the strategy of how we engage the countries and serve and reach out to the countries that are hostile or restricted to the gospel today is empowering and training the local church. You know, they're the ones that live there, they understand the culture, they understand the language, they understand the predominant religion in the area better than we will ever. I count it a privilege to come alongside those churches, to teach them what we know, to train, but at the same time, we're learning from them in the whole process, but to really empower them. That's where true, I believe, sustainable, long-term impact ministry can come from, and how we really transform a city, a town, a nation is through the local church there. And so I think that's one of the most important things that we do strategically as a ministry today in World Compassion, is empowering the local church in these countries.
50 years after its start, World Compassion continues to empower the local church in nations hostile to the gospel to reach their people. Around the world, Bibles are distributed, churches planted, disciples and leaders trained, and people introduced to Jesus through compassion evangelism efforts. We look forward to expanding our reach in the years to come and remain committed to continuing to follow God's leading to reach nations hostile to the gospel message and beyond. As we celebrate the past 50 years, we want to thank our loyal and generous partners who have made World Compassion's mission possible, allowing us to take the good news behind the Iron Curtain to the underground church in China, floated into North Korea, and smuggled into Iran. You have enabled us to preach the gospel in the mountains of Afghanistan and the jungles of Myanmar. We have been in nations during the fall of governments and the aftermath of natural disasters. We have stood before world leaders and provided homes to children rescued from trafficking. Thank you for being a part of our mandate to take the message of Jesus to nations that are hostile to the gospel. Together, we have a history to celebrate and a legacy to continue.